in the room, which is the fact that I haven't even finished my undergrad yet. And so ultimately, there is nothing that I can tell you about your experience that you don't know. There is nothing that I can tell you about your experience that you aren't already thinking and theorizing about and planning and all of that stuff. But what I can do is unearth some of the experiences that I've heard, the links between them that I've heard, talk about some of the links of solidarity that we can build in order to reimagine the PhD. And so I hope that you'll bear with me as I go through that. But I mean, I think what's been really abundantly clear, and I think the sharp edge of this has been felt through the pandemic, is that PGRs, and particularly those who are marginalized, particularly those who find themselves, in positions of being self-funded, with those additional responsibilities that Ellie just referred to, all of these things were going on, and institutions were in no way prepared to shift. Because, as was just being said, it's always about fitting students, fitting PhD candidates into a mold of the academy, rather than shifting the space to fit those candidates, right? And you know that better than me. We've seen throughout this process that regardless of what was going on in this time, international candidates who weren't even physically in the space of their research were being expected to meet deadlines. Self-funded students who'd had their material conditions completely changed were being told to continue, providing that money. All of these things that were up in the air were being completely removed from consideration, with candidates completely treated as pound signs rather than people. And we've said this a lot about students throughout the pandemic, but I think it was ultimately true more than for most when it comes to PhD students. And I say this because there is so much pressure, so much intensity baked into the PhD that leads to so much isolation, exhaustion, exploitation. And we know that these forms of exhaustion aren't just baked into PhDs in the UK. These are things happening the world over. We consistently see PhD students at the margins suffering from this isolation, exhaustion, and exploitation. We also see the forms of resistance, the forms of reimagination that we can learn from happening the world over too. We've just come off the back of student workers in Colombia completely, coming to terms with their agency in shifting power over there in the US. And so I think what I can add and contribute to this discussion is that power of reimagination, that power of recognizing agency and collectivism, because I think Ellie put it perfectly, in fact, in the intro, in that the university would not function without PhD students, full stop, point blank period. Because ultimately, when it comes to postgraduates who teach, when it comes to the research that you're doing, when it comes to the community that you foster, the longevity and the ties that you provide between different iterations of the student movement and between different iterations of staff, and all of these things that PhD candidates contribute to the university, it literally would not exist without you. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how we reimagine in that lens, because, one of the things that we are talking about, and I'll get onto the student strike in a bit, but one of the things that we often talk about in the student movement is the fight for free education. And I think often when people hear that, they think that we're harking back to some like false utopia of like the 80s or the 90s. I don't really know when that was, like that was a thing that happened. But this false utopia of that time when, some undergrads with many asterisks, had free education. But that's absolutely not what we're talking about. When we're talking about fully funded education, we need to recognize that, in many, many countries around the world, from cradle to grave, there is education that you can access at any point of your life, where you can research, where you can study, where you can actually experience education for the fullness of what it is and should be. And PhDs have to be part of that conversation. And so I wanted to say that from the off, because I think sometimes there is a complete misconception about what we mean when we talk about free and fully funded education. But it also needs to tie, when we say fully funded education, we also need to be tying that into conversations about pay and remuneration, right? Because yes, something can be free at the point of use for students, but unless you have proper pay, pensions and conditions for staff, you will always have not only other staff, but particularly postgrads who teach, bearing the brunt of an unsustainable system. And ultimately, I think like it's about recognizing that the system is crashing, right? Like what do markets do? They crash. And so when you add education together with a market, that's what's happening, right? It's falling over itself, it's crumbling under itself, because that is just not how an education system can or should function. And so what we're saying is, in this reimagination process, we know that we're teetering on this edge of this crash. What does it look like to build something that pours into the education that PhD candidates are seeking? And actually, that has to have proper pay, pensions and conditions, because that has to be grounded in a time where PhDs can do it for the love of PhDs, not because, not with all of the additional stress, the implications for mental health, and all of the other things that these failures of the current system, necessitate. So that's kind of thinking about reimagining the funding model a little bit. I won't get into it too much because we ain't got time for that. But I think there's also part of this that's about reimagining kind of what does justice, what does liberation, what does care in the university look like? And I wanted to kind of bring us to some research that NUS did a few years ago, which was done in collaboration with the 1752 group, and was all about misconduct, and specifically sexual misconduct in the university, and just a bit of a content note that I'm going to be talking about that for the next minute or so. So what this research found is that postgraduate students were far more likely to have experienced misconduct than undergraduate students. Twice the proportion of postgraduates than undergraduates reported a staff member attempting to draw them into a discussion about sex, for example. And we know that the power dynamics of a PhD are incredibly harmful positions for some students, disproportionately women and gender non-conforming folks. And I think it's really important to think about who are the kind of candidates for whom currently the PhD is not viable. Who are the people who aren't even in the room because they haven't even made it past, getting the funding, or they haven't made it to the end, or they haven't made it through. And so, I think that in the case of sexual violence and sexual misconduct, I also think that in regards to Black postgraduate, Black PhDs who, are very few and far between, and are often so constrained by the institution that they come out more exhausted than anything. I think that particularly in relation to disabled PGRs who are often, again, forced into situations where the stress and the kind of mental health implications of this, because of the conditions put upon them, is so dire. So I think when we see the kind of convergences of this unsustainability, be it in terms of the funding, be it in terms of the kind of broader elements of the PhD, there is so much to reimagine. How to create the conditions for something to be fully funded, to be rooted in safety and liberation, in care, to be lifelong, to remove those pressures, and also to think about all of the things that exist beyond the kind of education part of a PhD, from housing to climate to health and all of the other things that people need in order to survive, but also thrive, because that's nice too. So I feel like I've been speaking for a long time, so I'm going to draw my conclusions to a close, but ultimately I just wanted to say that this is not about harking back to some false time where things were amazing and life was a dream, because that doesn't exist. This is about carving out a kind of new vision for education, a new vision for the PhD, and that's a really exciting journey that I'm really like excited that UCU is on, and of course NUS is there with you. So thank you so much for having me, and I will close my remarks there.
Thank you so much, Larissa. That was brilliant. I'm just going to read out a couple before I hand over to Jo. I'm just going to read out a couple of things from the Jamboard, and I'll put the link here as well, abusing my own rule of not using the chat, but just in case people need it. So one person said, better recognition of how difficult it can be to be a parent/carer PGR. Absolutely. Fully funded, fully accessible, decarbonized, demilitarized, and decolonialized. That's what the ideal PhD looks like. And somebody said, what are the biggest challenges for PGRs at your university? The stigma of disabilities in an institution that wasn't built with disabled PhD students in mind. If you don't disclose, you don't get support. If you do disclose, you appear weak. So we're getting some really powerful stuff through on that. Please do keep contributing, because this is giving us just some really good testimony that we can use to inform our campaign. And we're going to come back to all of these issues kind of throughout the speaker series as well. But for now, I'll hand over to Jo. Over to you.
Thanks, Ellie, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to just pick up on something Larissa said at the end before kind of starting what I wanted to say, because in universities, right, particularly if you are not from a household or like a background that has had anyone who's gone to universities, right? It's a very alienating experience when you turn up, and there's loads of kind of rules and codes you have to learn really quickly in order to just not look weird in conversations. And one of them is like, you know, finding out what the London Review of Books is, and like, you know, just finding out loads of things that you didn't know exist. And the LRB, the London Review of Books, I think is an interesting one, talking about, you know, reimagining the university and the ideal PhD. Because I think it was Stefan Collini, but I don't want to smear him in case it wasn't. But I remember during the 2018 USS strikes, obviously there was a lot of think pieces about the neoliberal university and kind of what we want to create. And the most imaginative thing that was coming out of, you know, the LRB, which is this magazine that, you know, everybody who thinks they're an intellectual in universities reads, was how we needed to go back. We needed to go back to, you know, this imagined, rose-tinted, like beautiful age of universities, which, as Ellie just read, you know, when someone was saying what the ideal university looks like, was built for a very limited sort of person from a very limited background with a, you know, in general, a very specific skin color. And I remember being on a panel and saying that is exactly not where we want to go. Like, that university was not welcoming of a number of people, and in some ways a lot hasn't changed, and, you know, in other ways we're actually dealing with a government intent on a culture war which wants to pretend, you know, basic things like racism, structural racism, doesn't exist. So I just wanted to kind of riff off that before I even got going, because I think in some ways universities and academia in particular is really held back by this notion that revisiting a more kind of organic and honest time is what we should be aspiring for. And obviously that university had its whole range of problems. So to be self-indulgent for a moment, and I rarely do this, so sorry to subject everybody in this room to it, but I'm actually going to talk about myself and my PhD for a moment, because I think the question that Ellie and Alex posed for this event is a really important one, because we are often in academia confronted with what the ideal candidate looks like, whether it's a student, like a PGR, a member of staff if we're interviewing. And obviously that obscures that the notion of ideal in this moment is not neutral, that it is ultimately and, you know, fundamentally embedded with a whole life history, you know, potentially even an intergenerational experience that it's bringing into the university with it. So I think any conversation where we have about what we want to rebuild something to look like has to fundamentally unpack what is considered ideal, what is so entrenched, accepted that we don't even, not necessarily we in this room, because obviously we're here for a reason, but that we don't even call it what it is anymore. And I'm going to use my example as supposedly someone who is lucky to really point out just how bad this is, because in many ways I wasn't lucky. I benefited from a lot of privilege. So I went to university, first in my family to go to university. Well done me. Didn't know postgraduate study even existed, let alone that a PhD existed. I was very, very lucky that one of my lecturers in second and third year shared a very sort of similar background to me, working class, from a kind of industrialized northern town, had a lot of sympathy with my own kind of personal family history. So in some ways, I'm not from a very kind of privileged background, which is how this sort of, normally works. But he really kind of vibed with me, to use the kind of a Gen Z. That was for you, Larissa. We really vibed. And he didn't just mentor me. And I think this is a really important distinction. He sponsored me. He took me aside and said, you could do postgraduate study. Like, you are really good. Like, you could get this funding for your master's. Like, you could apply for this 1+3, which is, I know you don't want to do a PhD because you don't even know what it is yet, but you could get it. And no one had ever done that with me before, ever. And no one ever did that at the school I went to, the college I went to, nobody ever did that. This was the first time somebody, through purely identifying with me, seeing I was a good student, sponsored me and like co-wrote my application form with me and really invested time in me. And that made such a difference as to how I was perceived in the university, how my application then worked. So I could tell this narrative of, working class lass from like a northern city, but ultimately I also benefited a lot from this professor who, really identified with various aspects of me and extended to me some of the privilege that he had in the university. And I think it's really important for me to acknowledge in that sense, like, I wasn't really lucky at all. I was really kind of benefiting from these networks that people do lean into. And I think, therefore, when we're talking about ideal, that needs acknowledging, because there are many people who, many people who staff don't reach out to. There are many people who are marginalized, and I think the research topic even that we were doing was something that I now acknowledge and understand as being something that was very very acceptable to research councils. I didn't sort of know this at the time. It was very much about economics in a very Anglo-centric way. It was very much about kind of applied relevance to working people. I wasn't, for instance, sort of a migrant student trying to convince a university to fund something that wasn't clearly important to kind of European theories and philosophies. So I wanted to sort of start with that, because I think if we're not really reflective about our own role and our own trajectories into academia, particularly those of us who are kind of labelled as coming from non-privileged backgrounds, which people would definitely say about me, we're really kind of doing a disservice to what we need to reimagine the university to be about. So I wanted to start with that caveat, and I promise I'll move on now. But and I think that's important, really, because I think the questions that have been posed in this session are very much about an ideal PhD. And obviously there's no such thing really as an ideal PhD if we're not talking about how the university would change, because I think that the way in which I look at it as a sort of a former academic is, there is a PhD for somebody who just simply wants to do one, right? Who wants to complete a piece of research about a subject, which I think is a perfectly appropriate thing to do in and of itself. And then there are people who want to, do a PhD with a view to launching an academic career. There are numerous people in between all of that. And I think one of the problems that we currently have with an ideal PhD is the way in which the university charges. Oh, Lord, I'll be quick. The way in which, universities charge phenomenal fees is you have to instrumentalize your own PhD and you have to instrumentalize yourself. And therefore the university kind of presents all of these caveats that they put on, your research topic isn't really mainstream enough, or will you be able to complete it in time? So I will end, I guess, by saying, I think one of the reasons as a union we're engaged in not just what sort of multiple disputes, but multiple campaigns is, for me, whatever your answer is to the ideal PhD, or even the ideal university, is there is absolutely zero chance it can be imagined with a marketized fee regime that we have. It creates all manner of league tables, metrics, variables, ways of ranking and reifying people and knowledge in the most dehumanizing but also counterproductive manner for any form of knowledge production, or teaching, or genuine relationships that would be struck up. And it does, you know, to contribute to what Larissa said, completely makes institutions susceptible to predatory behaviors, whether that's stealing of academic research or, you know, exploiting power variables and abusing that power. So ultimately, and I promise I'll finish now, Ellie, you know, whatever your particular answer is and how you come at this, dismantling and removing the metrics of marketization and making education accessible so that we are not forced to comply with these phony metrics as what counts, and therefore who is deemed more ideal, is the most important thing we can do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jo. That was brilliant. And thank you so much for sharing your own experience as well. I think that's really important. There's still great things going on the Jamboard. Do please contribute and add some things in, but I'm going to head straight over to Nahal Bajwa from Red Square Movement. Over to you, Nahal. We can't hear you, Nahal.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Amazing. Okay, sorry, I did something with headphones. Yeah, so I'm here from Red Square Movement, which I'll just talk about quickly as a kind of backdrop. So RSM is a collection of student organisers which came out of last year's rent strikes and also fee strikes, involvement with NUS and Young Labour, as well as kind of bringing together people from a few other student campaigns. And it sort of emerged out of the renewed energy that the wave of rent strikes gave to the student movement in 2020, 2021. And there was a feeling, I think, that it's important to have like a strong left group of students organised to work alongside and with NUS and other institutions. And I think then after that, the experience that many of us had of trying and eventually, but sometimes like painfully slowly succeeding to make change in the institutions that we were in, led to this desire to kind of think about the university system as a whole and reimagine it, which we did in a few different ways. So including a kind of student organising school that we did with NUS and World Transformed and other people, and a couple of other sessions. So out of this thinking came a few key focuses, which I'll just talk about because it sort of signposts a reimagining of the university in a way which came out very strongly from those sessions. Firstly, there was the importance of repurposing universities for communities as part of our kind of collective heritage and not really intended to be kind of concealed within these big expensive buildings for a small paying elite, and also kind of keeping the fight alive for free, liberating education, and then being part of building a renewed radical student movement was kind of key in there. And I suppose like a core part of that was the idea of collective emancipation from systems of oppression and the role of education in that, which I think has been repeated like a lot, kind of implicitly but also explicitly in what we've been saying. But also another theme was this idea of love. It kind of sounds a bit intense, sorry, but like of forming deep, caring connections with each other and with communities outside of the university as it exists today, which we'll kind of all need to do to meet the challenges of the future anyway, but also because it's kind of key to building the world we want. And obviously building that world isn't going to happen exclusively within higher education. So how we achieve that and what's the role of a PhD student in that and how do all these other parts of the system play a role? I guess we can all agree that the pressure of the modern PhD leaves you very little time and mental space for these kinds of conversations and building those connections to some extent. And in a way, like at the start of the PhD, we're almost sort of ritually severed from further sources of contact and solidarity in a way. And we're also kind of psychologically severed by being told how distant students are from us, and they must be that way. And like, you're now elevating into the like rarefied, like academic elite. Like there's this weird kind of framing. And I think in terms of what can be done practically, obviously challenging some of those frames. So I'll talk about that a bit in a minute, but any moves that can be made to really open up more time and space within the PhD framework immediately for us to like navigate it more in line with a decent work-life organizing balance would be great. Though obviously that's asking a lot from people who don't really want us organized or organizing necessarily, but we could think of it, or we could frame it a different way, as part of a commitment to PhD student well-being as well. Like I would have gotten through my PhD a lot faster, leaving the organising to one side, which to be fair, I didn't really get involved with till the end. But I would have got through my PhD a lot faster. I still haven't got through my PhD, but like I would get through it a lot faster if someone had realised my access needs and kind of allowed me to have them, or space to think about them. But also just if the pressure had come off a little bit. I just feel like everyone is almost suffocated by this anxiety constantly. And obviously even our supervisors are under this intense pressure to get us through faster and faster. And it's been extremely counterproductive in a way, in a strange way. The pandemic was like the best thing that happened to my PhD, because I was able to get support from work with various assessments I needed, and the pressure came off a bit from various, like on the kind of university side, and I could make sensible choices about my own progress without just thinking, you know, no, I've just got to keep pushing. And it's weird. It's like they give us all this control over our work, by which they mean very little support with structuring it or with anything else. And somehow, yeah, we're still like treated like we can't be trusted with key decisions over timing and checking in and how often we want to do things. And that's obviously much worse for international PhD students. They're held to this like much more rigorous schedule in a way. And so I think we just need more time. And I think that time will actually save us time by kind of giving us this ability to like breathe and think, which I like somebody said that recently, like that higher education is considering we're meant to be like a place where everyone gets time to think. It's the last place anyone has time left to think at all, especially during term time. You're just like head down, which is ridiculous. But obviously on top of that, we need the structural stuff. Like we need more jobs. We kind of talked about all the other things we need. We need proper support for early career researchers. Like that would be better for undergrads, foundation year students, masters. It would be better for everyone. Because we need to have jobs to go into that like pay well and are not exhausting. And obviously that's part of like reversing this squeeze on all workers everywhere and on security for anyone, which is kind of clearly taking place across the economy. But it's this idea that, you know, even the idea of the ideal PhD student, like we shouldn't have to be the ideal PhD student to get jobs, because we don't only want those who were enabled by like whatever sources of luck or privilege to be the ideal PhD students to be in our institutions. Like we need a mix of people. We need like people with disabilities, learning differences. We need people who have had mental health issues that took them out for months, because our students are diverse. They have needs, and like they need tutors who can respond to that. But also we need those perspectives at the core of our research, because I don't think the solutions we need for like the modern world are going to require radical departures from how the current system works. And like people who've had really bad experiences of those things often have different things at stake in that, and have different ideas about it that are super valuable. Obviously, like all of that is separate from the basic fact it's a civil rights issue, and even staff without disabilities are struggling to stay afloat in the current system. But yeah, so there are things we can do immediately, and then there are things which might take some time. But I also think that there are already things that institutions can do. There are elements of leeway that they still have in terms of the support they provide to PhD students, like the pressure they put them under, and whether or not and how they value their time and work. Like they could fund more studentships. It would buy us all a lot of breathing space. Like it's just a change of, quite often it feels like it's just a change of perspective that's required. That could really radically shift the experiences many of us have. Like they don't need to put very much in place. They just need to sort of fighting at every turn. Like if you ask any, and they do it to undergrads, they do it to also, you know, they do it to everyone, they do it to staff, but you ask for something and immediately you're told that you don't need it. You just shut up and get on with it, which I think that battle itself is very draining, and that could change. But yeah, I'd kind of like finally like to add a bit on about what PhD students or postgrad researchers need to do. it's a bit of a conceptual thing. Well, obviously it leads to action, but I think it's really important that PGRs much more systematically than we kind of do at the moment, and regardless of their age or experience, start seeing themselves as students and workers. So obviously there's this kind of fight going on to see them as workers and see us as workers, but I feel like that solidarity needs to be built in both directions. So they need to be students as well. And I know we kind of know this, what I'm about to say, but it seems sometimes to be downplayed in higher education, like solidarity isn't something you just kind of pay up the hierarchy. And I think sometimes even the most progressive actors in higher education can almost reinscribe these hierarchies of knowledge and intelligence and act like we have in some way earned the right to like dismiss or ignore or speak for, or even just speak down to students as if we're not students, or as if anyone can ever like earn the right to do those things, which they can't obviously. But it's not just about solidarity. I feel like it's, we know as doctoral students and UCU members that we often need solidarity from our students, but that solidarity also needs to be conceptualized as going both ways, obviously, because that's how solidarity works. But also I feel like there are ways in which our students, but also PGRs as students are kind of disadvantaged, despite the consumer relationship the government keep pushing. There are other really important reasons to not dispense with our student status. Like most of us pay fees at some point, some kind of fees. We can be suspended or expelled if we don't progress enough. We're like low paid by anyone who pays us, which for most people isn't even the university. We're trying to get an education, and also the institution has a duty of care to us as students. And also if it's the only thing that will stick, which sometimes it is, as consumers, like, you know, there are reasons connected to that framing that are strategically useful sometimes, even if they're like also gross. And then I kind of think that like positioning as students is strategically important because of the way that postgrad researchers are so overloaded. Oh God, I timed myself. I've been going on for so long. But this is literally my last bit.
All right, great.
But like, because we're so overloaded and exhausted, and it often feels like campaigns of PhD students' rights overlook all the other campaigning that's going on a bit, like they tend to be going on separately. And there's this huge resource of like other students and their willingness and enthusiasm for supporting them. And, you know, like, for example, if your students' union won't support the strikes, like your members, PGRs are members, and they're some of the most, in theory, the most democratic organizations. Like there are always ways of getting things on the agenda and passing them through democratically. And so, yeah, it's kind of, there's kind of all these good reasons to not ignore that side of it. And you know, maybe like undergrads don't understand what PhD is, what your concerns are, or what they can do to help us, but we are training above all to be part of like an educational institution, and that's not confined to work. That's confined to how we reimagine social connections with our friends, but also with our students. And we can't really have the institutions we want if we're not practicing the social relations we need to kind of work within them. But also I just had one more thing, which was like RSM is actually organising a national strike solidarity call on Wednesday at 6 p.m. And it would be really great to see students and PhD students come to that and feed in and see how we can begin to kind of coordinate plans and actions across the country. And yeah, I'll put the link in the chat in a second. Sorry, I went on for so long. I didn't really
It's okay, Nahal. Thank you so much. I have so many feelings and thoughts about what you said. But for now, I'm going to say that we're going to have a break until 6:45 for people who need it. And then we'll come back and have a discussion and talk about some of the stuff that we've heard today. So see you at 6:45. And honestly, thank you so much, Nahal. I'm going to come back and email you about so many things. It was great.